Children were the biggest casualties in the Nigerian Civil War of 1967 to 1970. With the capture of the Cameroon border at Ikot Ekpene, Biafra was cut from any international land border and will henceforth rely on air or marine to import any of her necessities. The Nigerian government quickly adopted a starvation policy as a weapon of war in order to hasten Biafra's defeat, contrary to the Geneva Convention. The Nigerian finance minister Obafemi Awolowo was one of the most vocal about the inhumane policy, stating, "All is fair in war, and starvation is one of the weapons of war." With the number of children dying daily in Biafra due to the blockade, it was clear that the Biafran population was going into extinction, and something more drastic needed to happen. Bishops James Moina of Calabar and Bishop Geoffrey Okoye of Port Harcourt wrote to Pope Paul VI in Rome in February 1968, detailing the atrocities committed on Igbos and the eastern minority tribes since 1966, and what had continued to happen since the war began in May 1967. They appealed for an end to the conspiracy of silence in the international press and for humanitarian aid to save thousands of dying children. The German churches were the first to respond to the urgent call by Rome and held a joint press conference in Frankfurt on the 28th of June 1968. This press conference opened a floodgate of foreign journalists entering Nigeria and Biafra for the first time, and soon the image of starving Biafran children would be placed front and center on all televisions and newspapers across the world. Despite the public sympathy across the world, it did not translate to significant military or diplomatic aid to Biafra, and thousands continued to die from starvation. The great suffering in Biafra created the now famous Médecins Sans Frontières, or Doctors Without Border, and Apple founder Steve Jobs will credit his abandonment of his Christian faith to what he saw in Biafra. A German charity worker spoke the mind of the German public when he said, "The German race has a special responsibility to raise its voice in this matter. When the German capital Berlin was threatened with starvation and millions of Germans survived solely on care packets and school soup kitchens, we depended exclusively on external aid. How can we now be satisfied that only 10 flights a night are carried out for 10 million blockaded Biafrans, whereas 900 flights daily were needed for the survival of 2 million blockaded Berliners?" Tons of food were donated across the world through the World Council of Churches but could not reach Biafra due to Nigerian government blockade. Pilots had to risk their lives making perilous drops at Uli Airport at heavy costs. Pressure was then mounted on the Biafran authorities to allow the evacuation of vulnerable children to friendly countries. Biafran Minister of Justice, Sir Louis Mbanafo, struggled to approve this mainly because there were very few countries friendly to Biafra, and he was worried that children and their carers may be turned over to the hostile Nigerian government. The best country to send the starving children was the neighboring Cameroon. Apart from being close to their home, Cameroon hosts a well-organized infrastructure run by the Protestant and Catholic churches. A large number of European priests and religious working in eastern Nigeria have missions in southern Cameroon, and never really let the artificial boundary affect their apostolic works in both countries. Between September and October 1968, they were ordered by their parent missions to begin preparation for the receipt of refugee children in Cameroon, and Tiko and Mamfe were selected as special children homes. However, the Cameroonian president, Ahmadou Ahidjo, a Fulani Muslim, originally from Adamawa region of northern Nigeria, was squarely on the Nigerian side in a war that had increasingly assumed a religious tone. Biafra, a predominantly Christian nation in eastern Nigeria, was in a war with a Nigerian government dominated by northern Nigerian Muslims. President Ahidjo will vehemently oppose this idea, and Cameroon was dropped at last minute despite the incredible preparation made by the Cameroon Relief Organization, CAMRO. It is also important to mention that Nigerian Christians, particularly in western Nigeria, opposed Biafra. A delegation of Nigerian Christians, led by P.T. Odumosu and Bola Ige, persuaded the World Council of Churches to remove every mention of Biafra in the 1968 Uppsala Conference. Archbishop Aggie of Lagos, achieved a similar result in 1969 African Bishops' Conference in Kampala. But particularly devastating to the Biafran cause were the visit of a Nigerian Protestants delegation led by Bishop Segun of Lagos to Britain in June 1968. That particular visit, threatening the split of the Anglican Church in Nigeria from her Church of England communion, forced a change of policy by the Church of England, and Archbishop of Canterbury switched from his earlier demand for his government to recognize that the artificial unity in Nigeria has disappeared beyond recall to simply supporting British government policy. With Cameroon out of the way, Gabon and Ivory Coast were then chosen as destinations for evacuating Biafran children as the alternative, although a few children made it all the way to Lusaka, Zambia in East Africa. Due to the indiscriminate bombings of Biafran civilians, a large number of children were displaced from their families, and as much of 25% of the children flown out of Biafra had no identification. The Biafran Children's Home in Gabon was named the Kinderdorf and was financed by the German churches. It was one of the largest of such facilities for Biafran children outside of Biafra, and hosted over 2,000 children in 26 houses with modern amenities. It had 90 Biafran staff and 60 European staff with monthly expenditure of over 400,000 Deutsche Marks. One of the German doctors there, a Miss Bonn, relocated to Biafra in August 1969 and will head the children's hospital at Okporo till her deportation after the war in 1970. Another country that welcomed Biafran children at this time was the tiny island of São Tomé and Príncipe. Then a Portuguese colony, its airport provided free access to much-needed food and sometimes military supplies that came into Biafra. The Portuguese Governor-General will personally adopt 120 Biafran children at the Children's Home in São Tomé, run by Irish nuns. The children's home here was financed by Caritas Internationalis, Austrian Caritas, and reader donations from La Stampa, a daily newspaper based in Turin, Italy. When the war ended in January 1970, the Nigerian government maintained a hostile policy towards the Red Cross, Caritas, and all the other humanitarian agencies that helped Biafra avoid complete starvation. Many European priests and religious groups that were in Biafra were detained and then deported, the most prominent of which was the Archbishop of Owerri, His Grace, Brendan Whelan. On the other hand, the likes of Geoffrey Okoye, the Bishop of Port Harcourt, who were outside Nigeria at the end of the war, were not permitted to return to their home in Nigeria. This hostility presented a big obstacle in the plan to return Biafran children outside of Biafra. Despite the big announcement of national reconciliation, an order by the Nigerian ruler, Yakubu Gowon, on the 14th of January 1970, created a blacklist of countries and organizations that were not allowed to participate in the return of Biafran children. This would not have been surprising to these organizations who had been spending quite a lot of money to keep thousands of Biafran children due to the Nigerian government policy of using starvation as a weapon of war. For example, the German churches were spending between 150 to 200,000 Deutsche Marks on these children's homes, while Caritas International spent about $42,000 a month in 1970. Eventually, the Bishop of Cape Coast in Ghana, J.K. Amisa, was approached by various humanitarian organizations to intervene. It was Bishop Amisa who was able to prevail on the Christian Council of Nigeria and the Catholic Secretariat in Lagos to quit the politics and allow Biafran children to come home. With the help of these two groups, the Nigerian government was convinced to begin talks with the international groups to facilitate the return of those children. The Nigerian government continued placing obstacles on return of these children by refusing to allow the organizations that looked after the children to handle their return. Instead, it created the East Central State Rehabilitation Commission to handle it, despite their lack of funding and expertise. It chose Lagos Airport as the return port, even though Enugu Airport made the most logistical sense in terms of proximity to the children's families. It was eventually persuaded to let the children return through Port Harcourt Airport. After months of delay, reception camps were established at Azumini, Ikot Ekpeni, Ngor Okpala, Port Harcourt, and Mugbidi in October 1970, with the generous donation of the German Caritas and other donors. By 1972, most of the children had returned to Nigeria despite all the difficulties. A public campaign was made across eastern Nigeria to create awareness about the returned children so that families are able to trace their children. The tracing of these children were largely successful, but some of the returned children were unable to reconnect with their families and ended up at orphanage centers at the end of December 1971. Please consider liking and sharing this video